part one of Plastic Planet, right? Remember, this is an important piece kind of covering what we're doing, what stage five global capitalism is doing to the planet. So here's me reading um, part one. Again, this is optional, so you don't have to watch this. But if you want to hear me read as you follow along, please listen. So, how big oil and standard soda kept a global environmental calamity, which is like a disaster, a secret for decades. And you're only going to answer 10 of the 15 questions. You choose which 10. Every human on Earth is ingesting nearly 2,000 particles of plastic a week. These tiny pieces enter our unwitting bodies from tap water, food, and even the air, according to an alarming academic study sponsored by the World Wildlife Fund. For nature, dosing us with 5 grams of plastic, many come with chemicals linked to cancer, hormone disruption, and developmental delays. Since the paper's publication last year, Senator Tom Udall, a plain-spoken New Mexico Democrat with a fondness for white cowboy hats and turquoise bolo ties, has been trumpeting the risk. We are consuming a credit card's worth of plastic a week, Udall says at events with constituents. He will brandish a visa from his wallet and declare, "You are eating this, folks." So stop, pause. What is your reaction to eating or consuming a credit card worth of plastic a day? With new legislation, the Break Free from Plastic Pollution Act of 2020, Udall is attempting to get the government to confront the plastics industry and to force companies that profit from plastics to take accountability for the waste they create. Unveiled in February, the bill would ban many single plastics and force corporations to finance end of life programs to keep plastic out of the environment. We're going back to that principle, the senator tells Rolling Stone. This is the magazine that it comes from. The polluter pays. The battle pits Udall against his allies in Congress, against some of the most powerful corporate interests on the planet, including the oil majors and chemical giants that produce the building blocks for our modern plastic world. Think Exxon, Dow, and Shell. Then consumer giants like Coca-Cola, Nestle, Unilever that package their products in the stuff. Big plastic isn't a single entity. It's more like a corporate supergroup. Big oil meets big soda with a puff of big tobacco, responsible for trillions of plastic cigarette butts in the environment every year. And it combines the lobbying and public relations might of all three. So, again, I didn't realize, quick pause, to how much plastic we actually use. We can think about how much plastic's in every single thing, including packaging. Americans have also considered against problem plastics, scapegoating packing peanuts, grocery bags, and drinking straws for the sins of our unsustainable consumer economy. We've been slow to recognize that we're actually in the midst of a plastic pandemic. So, pause real quick, define pandemic. Over the past 70 years, we've gotten hooked on disposable plastics, goods, and packaging as plastics become a lifeblood of American culture and speed, convenience, and disposability that conquered the globe. Plastic contains our hot coffee and frozen dinners. It is a material of childhood, of Pampers to Playmobil, PlayStation 4. It cloaks our e-commerce purchases and is woven in our sneakers, fast fashion, and business fleece. Humans are now using millions of plastic bottles a minute and 500 billion plastic bags a year, including those things we use to bag up our plastic laden trash. It'd be interesting to pause and think about how much plastic is in your house right now. How much plastic do you consume on a daily basis, besides the credit card that you ingest? But the world's plastic is not so easily contained. Massive quantities are forever spilling into the oceans, the equivalent of a dump truck load of every minute. Plastic is also fouling up our mountains, our farmland, and spiraling into unimaginable environmental disaster. John Hochar is a marine biologist who leads the Ocean Campaign for Greenpeace and led to the group's environmental response to BP oil spill in the Gulf. Increasingly, his work is centered on plastics. This is a much bigger problem than just an ocean issue, or even a pollution issue, he said. We have found plastics everywhere we have ever looked. It's in the Arctic, in the Antarctic, in the middle of the Pacific, it's the Pyrenees, and in the Rockies. It's settling out of the air and raining down on us. So I want you to summarize this paragraph right here. Summarize this paragraph. Right, more than half of the Earth now have been created since 2020, and plastic pollution is on pace to double by 2030. At its root, The global plastic crisis is a product of our addiction to fossil fuels like oil. The private profit and public harm of the oil industry is well understood. Oil is refined and distributed to customers who benefit from gasoline's short, useful lifespan, and a combustion engine, leaving behind atmospheric pollution for generations. Right? So remember, go think back to your um, global warming lessons we did at the beginning of the year. But this is the same pattern, and the same tragedy of the commons is playing out with another gift from the oil and gas giants whose drilling draws up petroleum building blocks for plastics. These are turned into industrial complexes that manufacture in bottles, bags, textiles, and toys and consume who benefit from their transit use before blowing them away. Right? We don't think of plastic being part of the oil problem, but oil is how you make plastics. Plastics are just a way of making things out of fossil fuels. Jim Plunkett, an executive director of the Basel Action Network, BAN, is devoted to enforcement of the Basel Convention, an international treaty that blocks the developed world, so like the Europe, America, Japan, things like that, from dumping hazardous waste on the developing world. So think countries that are not as wealthy as those. And recently expanded effort next year to include plastics. For Americans who religiously sort their recycling, it's upsetting to hear about the plastics being lumped with toxic waste. Right? We don't think of plastic bottles as toxic waste, like from a radiation from a factory. But poisonous parallels act. They really sold people on the idea that plastics can be recycled because there's a fraction of them that are, says Plunkett. It's fraudulent. Define fraudulent. When you drill down into plastic recycling, you realize it's a myth. I'm going to define degrade here in a second. Since 1950, the world has created 6.3 trillion kilograms of plastic waste, and 91% has never been recycled even once. 91%. According to the landmark 2017 study publishing in the Journal of Scientific Advances, unlike aluminum, that's what you get cans made out of, which can be recycled again and again, plastic degrades in reprocessing and is almost never recycled more than once. A plastic soda bottle, for example, might get turned into carpet. Modern technology hardly improved things. Of the 78 billion kilograms of plastic packaging materials produced in 2013, only 14% were even collected for recycling, and just 2% were recycled to compete with non-recycled plastics. Recycling delays rather than avoids final disposal, and the science authors write, and most plastics remain for centuries. So think about, what is the problem of recycling? Is this different than what you thought was happening to recycling? When I thought, oh, everything gets recycled if I put it in there, but what's actually happening? As the globalized economy boomed, the toxic reality was hidden overseas. This goes back to the thing I asked you about earlier in the slides about how we hide things overseas. Plastic was tossed out here and picked up at domestic recycling facilities, which target easy to sort and reprocess clear plastic bottles, milk jugs, and detergent containers. The leftovers were tied up in dirty bales and shipped to Asia. China took them because there was some high value of the material in there, states a former waste management executive. Oftentimes, he says, Chinese recyclers would dump those bales into the river and separate the materials and pick the better stuff. And then they simply let the rest go downstream. So we took our trash and we just sent it to China and then dirtied their rivers instead of ours. The target plastics weren't even recycled in state-of-the-art facilities, rather shredded and melted down in rudimentary, that means basic, factories, often staffed by whole families' children, including barely making a living with a toxic mountain of plastic. So again, think about what our waste is doing to people overseas. We just hide it, right, instead of having to deal with our own problems. Seeing political danger in its growing pollution crisis, China blocked most plastic imports in 2018. And this national sword policy roiled international recycling markets. Attempts to recreate the China model in other Southeast Asian Asia has backfired in pollution and protests. Pulling the back on the curtain of waste, executive describes our dirty little secret. So explain here, why is it our dirty little secret? Americans who believed they were diverting plastic from the trash were ironically fueling the waste crisis half a world away. It is easy for American and European packaging polluting the countryside of Southeast Asia, states a 2019 report from the Break Free from Plastics Coalition, which coordinates the annual audit of plastic waste. When people in the global north throw something away, so global north, America, Europe, much of it ends up in the global south because there is no such thing as away. So again, think about how that's different than what you thought about how recycling actually works. The worst of our global plastics crisis is borne by the oceans. So, and here in this section, I want you to focus on what is it doing. We've talked about what it's doing to other countries' land, but what is it doing to the ocean? The worst of our global plastics is borne by the oceans. Roughly 8 billion kilograms of plastics enter the world's water every year. And the problem is most acute in emerging coastal economies. The volume entering the oceans can be hard to comprehend, admits Jenna Jambeck, an engineer at the University of Georgia who has published path-breaking science that quantifies plastic leakage to the oceans. It's equal to 5 grocery-sized bags full of plastic for every foot of coastline in the world, she says. If you imagine us all standing hand to hand, covering the coastlines of the entire world, that is what is in front of each one of us. Marine plastics picked up by the current collect in massive ocean gyres. The Great Pacific Garbage Patch, which is right here, by the way, that's what that picture is now twice the size of Texas. There are swirling chemical spills, but unlike crude oil, the long molecular chains in plastics don't exist in nature and don't meaningfully biodegrade. Google biodegrade. The same properties that make plastics so versatile, that means can do anything switchable, like malleable. The science advances authors, including James Beck, makes those materials difficult or impossible for nature to assimilate, right? So oil is natural, plastics are not. So it's harder for the earth to absorb them, unlike oil. Instead, bulk plastics wear down into microplastics, a category for particles roughly the width of your pinky fingernail, deteriorating further into nanoparticles, so very, very tiny pieces. In open waters, plastics are consumed by fish, seabirds, and mammals, which are washing up dead in gigantic numbers. Last year, whales in Italy, the Philippines died just weeks apart of their stomachs packed with ingredients, indigestible plastic bags. Think about a whale full of plastic bags. In December, a sperm whale washed ashore a scallop with more than 200 pounds of plastic in its gut. The pollution visible on ocean surfaces represent just 1% of humans dumped into the oceans. The rest lies beneath, including several miles in the Marianas Trench, where researchers have spotted plastic bags and measured microplastics concentrations of 2,000 parts per liter. Even if you know what that means, you should know that it's a lot. Without dramatic change, the amount of plastics entering the ocean every year, already intolerable, is projected to more than double by 2025. And I bolded this because it affects us in Colorado. The story on land, so now we've switched, that was the oceans, so nothing about what happens on land. The story on land is hardly better. Plastics are widely used in agriculture, and microplastic pollution is somewhere between 4 and 23 times higher in the soil than in the sea, says Lily Fair, editor of Plastics Atlas, which documents the global reach of plastic pollution. Microplastics, though thought to be carried by the winds, have been found in pristine terrestrial, that means Earth. Terrestrial means Earth. That's why we call them extraterrestrials, because they're not from Earth. Terrestrial environments, including the polar ice caps. In Colorado, plastic fibers have been discovered in precipitation. That's rain, snow. It is in the rain, in the snow, lamented U.S. States Geological Survey researcher Gregory Weatherby. It is part of our environment now. Even landfills may be creating long-term hazards. 2019 study in water research found microplastics contamination as high as 24 parts per liter in a landfill runoff, offering preliminary evidence that the landfill isn't the final sink place of plastics, the researcher wrote, but a potential source of microplastics. This pollution is planet-wide, impossible to fully remediate, and threatens the disruption of natural systems, including those that allow oceans to remove carbon from the atmosphere. Humans are conducting a singularly uncontrolled experiment on a global scale. Sorry, I need a water. Write the researchers of Science Advances. in which billions of metric tons of material will accumulate across all major terrestrial and aquatic ecosystems in the planet. Where all the test subjects are in the experiment, as plastics accumulate in the food web, appear in seafood, table salt, and ironically, even in bottled water. Many plastics are mixed with toxic chemicals. Joe Valancourt is the CEO of a company that refines waste plastic into fuel, a process that requires removing such contaminants from curbside recycling. In one little 10-pound batch, he says, we found 1,000 different chemicals. Some of these additives are linked to cancer and serve health problems. As plastics break down over time, they can also absorb toxins from the environment, including PCBs. The threat to human health is complex, so now we're focusing on what art does to our health, and poorly understood. There are a lot more questions than answers at this point, says Mark Hahn, a toxicologist at Woods Hole Oceanography Institute who studies microplastics. Some plastics likely pass through the human gut, like sand, he says, but scientists have found that tiny plastic particles can get into the bloodstream of mussels. Those are not mussels like in your arms, but mussels are like shellfish, and into the organs of fish. Airborne nanoplastics can be inhaled into the lungs, and they are lodging somewhere and physically blocking something, or causing an inflammatory reaction, Hahn asks, or they are carrying their additives and contaminants and delivering them somewhere. To the brain. Hahn, a sober and skeptical scientist, is concerned about the rising tide of plastics in the environment. If there's a problem now, he says, it's only going to get worse. So take a quick minute to define polymer. The story about how we got into this fix is short and modern, and American as hell. In the late 1860s, a bush-beard inventor in New York sought to claim a $10,000 prize to developing an alternative to ivory. That's what elephant tusks are made of, and the keys of very expansive pianos. With a primitive polymer, Google, John Wesley Hyatt created and later peddled to the consuming public plastic billiard balls, those are for pool, piano keys, and false teeth. Plastics were introduced in the early 1900s by Leo Baekeland, and a Belgian immigrant whose Bakelite polymer withstood high temperatures and insulated against electricity. Touted as the material of 1,000 uses, and its logo a bee floating above the mathematical symbol for infinity, Bakelite became integral, it's important, essential to the automotive and electric industries, as well as consumer goods like dominoes, telephone receivers, and 78 RPM records, so vinyl records. Plastics wove themselves deeper into American life with the invention of nylon in the 1930s, and their versatility made them indispensable, means incredibly important, to the military in World War II, featuring in the parachutes, tires, and plexiglass windows. Plastics boomed as a hallmark of Americans' post-war consumer culture. So think about how plastics have benefited us. And the virtues of plastics are as real now as they were then. Plastic allows us to do more with less, says Steve Russell, Vice President of Plastic Divisions of American Chemistry Council, which represents petrochemical companies. Those are the people who make plastics. Russell announced his retirement in early 2020. Whether it's to make cars lighter so they use less energy or build buildings more efficient, they allow us to deliver a safer and sanitary drinking water through plastic pipes that don't corrode. Pointing to pervasive use of plastics in medicine, he highlights their peerless benefit for hygiene and health and safety. So that concludes part 1. Make sure you answered 10 of the 15 questions, and I will see you in part 2.